Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Presta Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastya Chadeshatarane Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchkalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha, Paditanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Hare Krishna. So, devotees, just to catch up a little bit, we were there right at the end of the second chapter, but we didn't quite reach the actual end. It would have been nice, but that's okay. We were in the final section. The final section is, it runs from verse 54 through to verse 72, which is the concluding verse of the chapter. And they're different. Well, you remember the subject matter. The basic point was that Arjuna wanted to find out the symptoms. How do you recognize who a person who is stita pragya, transcendentally situated? And of course, as with almost anything, at least so many things, if a person has some particular qualification, ability, or some sort of whatever assets, then you'll be able to recognize there'll be certain symptoms. If the person is wealthy, there'll be certain symptoms. If the person is poor, there'll be certain symptoms. And if a person is spiritually advanced, there'll be certain symptoms. So Arjuna asked, can you please explain what are those symptoms? And then he asked, actually in specific terms, the advanced transcendentalist, how does he speak? How does he sit? How does he walk? And then Lord Krishna goes on from verse 55 to the end, verse 72, to elaborate, to respond, to answer that question, or those questions. Perhaps not entirely in as direct and straightforward and simple a way as we might like. I mean, some of it's straightforward. Some of it is not straightforward. It's, kind of subtle, at least we can say. But we can get the idea. We definitely can get the idea. So he explains different symptoms, and along with the different symptoms, he explains different challenges. So, in other words, how does the devotee, the advanced devotee, act in relation to the sense objects when the sense objects are present? Sense objects which, and then Krishna describes how normally people, they're very much affected when they're in the presence of sense objects, and they become attached and lusty, and then gradually they fall down deeper into material existence. So that he explains, But then he explains how the advanced devotee does not do that. So like this, the discussion was going on. That was on Friday, what was it? No, that was yesterday, wasn't it? Yeah. And so now we're going into the last section, more or less, second to last actually. Last section is just the last verse. Well, okay, I'm going to, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start, I'm going to go over a couple of sections. I'm going to go over the section which is verses 64 and 65, because they're really nice. They're really nice verses. Yeah, that's good. They're very Krishna conscious verses. We went over the verses about lust and all that, and the dangers if you're not on that elevated level, and how the person who is deals with those challenges. So let's have a look here, verses 64, 65. 64. But a person free from all attachment and aversion, and able to control his senses through regulative principles of freedom, can obtain the complete mercy of the Lord. That's interesting. Mercy. This is actually the first time in the whole Bhagavad Gita where there's really been a clear mention about getting mercy from the Supreme Lord. And we'll read verse 65 too. For one thus satisfied in Krishna consciousness, the threefold miseries of material existence exist no longer. In such satisfied consciousness, one's intelligence is soon well established. Okay, so that's a small section on its own. And it's interesting that in both verses, it's not so clear. In the second verse, as it is in the first verse. It's clear in verse 64. It's not so clear in verse 65 unless you read the Sanskrit, that in both verses, these two verses are particularly dealing with how the Krishna conscious person, the advanced devotee, walks, or what does the person actually do? What does the person actually do? And in other words, how do they manifest their advanced position in their practical activities? So the first interesting thing at least, is that in both verses, Lord Krishna uses the word prasadam, or prasad, in one form or another. And particularly in the first verse, 64, that any person who's controlling their senses through regulative principles of freedom means basically by engaging in devotional service that we discussed yesterday. So such a person can get the special thing which has not really been mentioned before. That is the complete mercy of the Lord. Now that's important. That's very important. It's not just a matter that you just control your senses. It's not just even a matter of, to oversimplify it a bit, it's not just a matter that you engage in higher activities, although you do, means activities in devotional service. But it's not quite as simple as just doing the right thing. The point is that when you do those Krishna conscious activities, when you render service to the Lord, and then you get higher taste, as we read, well, where does the higher taste come from? It doesn't just come spontaneously from nowhere. It comes from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this is a very important factor in the whole picture. And of course, as Bhagavad Gita goes on and through the different chapters, then this particular feature of the picture will become more prominent, and it'll become more clear how it's important, and not just important, but how it's really the essential feature in the whole picture when you're trying to make progress. Yes, so this devotee anyway, verse 64, the devotee has no interest really in material activity. As Prabhupada says here in the purport, although the person in full Krishna consciousness may apparently be on the sensual platform, because of his being Krishna conscious, he has no attachment to sensual activities. So in other words, when Krishna says here in the verse 64, but a person free from all attachment and aversion and able to control his senses through regulative principles of freedom, it means that this is all happening because of the devotee being Krishna conscious, not just because they're very strong and they can fight off attractions and things like that, but they're getting the special mercy of the Lord through their engagement in his service, and in that way they are protected. So yeah, this is very important. This chapter, after all, is the sort of summary of the whole Bhagavad Gita in advance. And like we said, as Bhagavad Gita goes on, this point is just going to come out again and again and again, that we have to take shelter of the Lord in his service. And then when we do that, he gives mercy. And when he gives mercy, then we can transcend. Then we can go back to Godhead. And in the meantime, be free from the disturbing attractions and whatnot on the material level. So yeah, this consciousness is the causeless mercy of the Lord, Prabhupada says at the end of the purport, which the devotee can achieve in spite of his being attached. Even though we may not be completely on the pure platform, we still have some, lower tendencies to some degree at least. But despite that, the devotee can get, or rather we can just say the Lord gives mercy so we can progress. And then 65, of course, does not have a purport actually, but it's just explaining the advanced position, feeling very satisfied in devotional service under the shelter of the Lord. Then all the miseries of material life, they just they go away. And in that satisfied consciousness, your intelligence, your ability to function becomes very nice. There's a comment here from Srila Prabhupada from a lecture. Let me just read it, it's interesting. The yogis and others are trying to control the senses by force. I shall go to the Himalayas. I shall not see beautiful women. I shall close my eyes. And that's how they're thinking. So then Prabhupada continues, you cannot control your senses. You don't need to go to the Himalayas. Remain in Los Angeles and use your eyes to see Krishna. You are better than a person who goes to the Himalayas. You don't need to change your position. Engage your ears hearing Bhagavad Gita as it is. You'll forget all nonsense. Engage your eyes in seeing the beauty of the deity, Krishna. Engage your tongue in tasting Krishna prasadam. Engage your legs coming to the temple. Engage your hands working for Krishna. Engage your nose in smelling the flowers offered to Krishna. Then your senses will be controlled and perfection is assured. You don't have to control your senses forcibly, but you have to change the engagement, the status, and that will be very helpful. Okay, so now we go on to the section from verse 66, the following verse, to verse 71, which is just before the last verse, which is in a little subsection of its own. So what is the subject matter here? Well, the thing is that Arjuna had asked, how does he sit? How does he walk? These questions. Krishna has answered those questions now. He's answered those questions. Now, what's he going to do? He's going to explain the result of it all, which is, you could say among other things, but certainly one prominent thing is that you become peaceful, unaffected by the disturbing influences of the material world. But as is the way he is presenting things in this whole section here, he also presents some challenges. He presents both. How you can be peaceful, and how, if you're not careful, if you do the wrong things, then you definitely won't be peaceful. But if you do the right things, then you will be peaceful. So do the right things. Okay, so let's read through. This is our practice, if you remember now. We'll read through all the verses. What is it? It looks like 6 verses. Or 7 even, 6 verses. Let's read these verses and then go back and just have a look at some of the points in the purports. Okay, this is 66. One who is not connected with the Supreme in Krishna consciousness can have neither transcendental intelligence nor a steady mind, without which there's no possibility of peace. And how can there be any happiness without peace? So in other words, if you have transcendental intelligence, if you're connected with Krishna in Krishna consciousness, in devotional service, and you're getting his mercy, then you'll be peaceful. And maybe not simply peaceful, you can be very happy. So now here comes a warning. Verse, 67. 67. As a strong wind sweeps away a boat on the water, even one of the roaming senses on which the mind focuses can carry away a man's intelligence. And verse 68. Therefore, O mighty armed, one whose senses are restrained from their objects is certainly of steady intelligence. We're going to go back and make a few comments on each verse. Okay, so here's something interesting. Verse 69, it's a little sort of different perspective, but it's very relevant. What is night for all beings is the time of awakening for the self-controlled, and the time of awakening for all beings is night for the introspective sage. And verse 70, a person who is not disturbed by the incessant flow of desires that enter like rivers into the ocean, which is ever being filled but is always still, can alone achieve peace, and not the man who strives to satisfy such desires. And verse 71, a person who has given up all desires for sense gratification, who lives free from desires, who's given up all sense of proprietorship and is devoid of false ego, he alone can attain real peace. So that's the section there, or subsection actually. So let's go through the verses just briefly, and then we'll move on. So first of all, 66. 66. 66. Here it is. Yeah, okay. So here's a very important point. How can there be happiness without peace? Anyway, that's something we can think about, people should think about. And in the purport, Srila Prabhupada makes an interesting point. It's right in the middle of the purport, that if a person is not in Krishna consciousness, there cannot be a final goal for the mind. Disturbance is due to want of an ultimate goal. And when one is certain that Krishna is the enjoyer, proprietor, and friend of everyone and everything, then one can, with a steady mind, bring about peace. Yeah, so, Prabhupada, like we've said a couple of times, Prabhupada is regularly, even when a verse, sometimes when verses don't specifically mention Krishna consciousness as such, it may be more just like being transcendental or spiritual or something. But because these states can only be achieved through Krishna consciousness, then Prabhupada injects Krishna into the verse. Yeah, it's interesting. So here, we cannot achieve happiness, peace, what to speak of happiness, without being in Krishna consciousness, not just detached and renounced, but in Krishna consciousness, because as we read in the previous two verses, then you get the mercy of the Lord. And when you get the mercy of the Lord, then it's like just a big breakthrough. That's the thing for the breakthrough. So, okay, now for you devotees doing Bhakti Shastri, we have one of your special questions here. It's based on chapter 2 here, verse 66. Verse 66, which we just read right now. And first of all, there's a quote. You must write this down. We're going to refer to verse Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, Chapter 12, verse 24. 11, 12, 24. And it goes as follows. With steady intelligence, you should develop unalloyed devotional service by careful worship of the spiritual master. And with the sharpened axe of transcendental knowledge, you should cut off the subtle material covering of the soul. Upon realizing the Supreme Personality of Godhead, you should then give up that axe of analytic knowledge. Isn't that interesting? Sure, that is interesting. Well, that's Lord Krishna speaking to Uddhava. 11, 12, 24. And you know what the question you're going to have to give in your exam is? What is the verse number? So you better note that down and check it. Okay, that's fine. So on we go now to verse 67. And 67 is very interesting because, for a number of reasons, but definitely one reason is we just read in verse 60. Do you remember? We read in verse 60. Let me just paraphrase it or read it again, what verse 60 says. Verse 60 says that 60. Is it 60? What am I talking about? Is it? No. They've given me the wrong information. Look at that. Anyway, just a sec. We just read. I remember we just read. Which verse is it? It's 67. Yeah. No, it's not. Ah. Which verse is it? Well, Shri Radharadnath Ki, Shri Giri Govardhan Ki, Shri Caitanya Mahaprabhu Ki Jai. Anyway, we just read in one of the verses that how the senses can deviate the mind. And yeah, here we are. It is verse 60. The senses are so strong and impetuous, O Arjuna, that they forcibly carry away the mind, even of a man of discrimination who's endeavoring to control them. All right, so now fast forward, we're to verse 67. Verse 67. Yeah, so it's our next verse. As a strong wind sweeps away a boat on the water, even one of the roaming senses on which the mind focuses can carry away a man's intelligence, or a woman's too. So, excuse us. Yes, so verse 60 was just saying in a broad sense, the senses, all of our different senses, can drag us away from Krishna consciousness. This verse 67 is now saying just one of the senses, just like a strong wind can just sweep away a boat on the water, just one of the senses. Oh, yeah, so it's intense. Just like a small boat can be easily dragged away. So therefore, as Prabhupada in the purport, Srila Prabhupada in the purport gives the example of Maharaj Ambarish, which we've already seen, we've encountered in 2 or 3 places actually, how Maharaj Ambarish was just fully engaged in every respect. His eyes were looking at the Lord, his hands were doing things in service. He was walking to the temple, he was eating prasadam, he was thinking of the Lord, etc., etc. In this way, he was engaged, and he was therefore on the transcendental platform. Plus, what else? Devotees, tell me what else? He was getting the mercy of the Lord. He was getting the mercy of the Lord. So verse 68 is talking about how we have to restrain the senses. And Srila Prabhupada, let's just here read, it's the last sentence in the purport. Basically what's been said is that the senses are like enemies, but they can be controlled by being engaged in the service of the Lord. And Prabhupada says, one who's understood this, that only by Krishna consciousness is one really established in intelligence, and that one should practice this art under the guidance of a bona fide spiritual master. So, one who has understood this is called a sadhaka, or a suitable candidate for liberation. And Prabhupada makes a comment in a class on this verse, or a few of the verses here around this place in the second chapter. Prabhupada says, everyone in this material world is looking for peace, but they don't want to control the senses. For example, if you're diseased and the doctor says, take this medicine or follow this diet, but you refuse, you take whatever you want against the instruction of the physician. So how can you be cured? Similarly, we want to be cured of the chaotic condition of this material world. We want peace and prosperity, but we're not willing to control the senses. And now on to verse 69. Interesting verse. What is night? For the ordinary people is the time of awakening for the self-controlled, for the devotees. And the time of awakening for the ordinary people is night for the devotees, or the introspective sage, but we would say the devotees. And basically, in the purport, Prabhupada's just sort of expanding a little bit on that point. It means that the ordinary people, they want to sleep in the early morning when the weekend comes and they don't have to work. They wake up, perhaps at their regular time, whatever that is, and first of all, they may not realize that they don't have to work. And they think, oh gosh, I've got to work. But then they realize, no, it's the weekend. Oh, I can sleep in. So they go back to sleep. But the devotee has already got up. The devotee already got up, at, not later than 4, we hope. Ravindra Prabhu was telling me he's getting up at 2 o'clock these days because he's got so much service. He needs to chant his rounds early in the morning. All right. So anyway, early in the morning, the devotees get up, and it's like the best time. But that's the time the ordinary people sleep and sleep. And then at night, like, normally for us, 9 o'clock or whatever, something like that, we go and take rest. For the ordinary people, that's when the party starts. And all these things, through past midnight, it's just, so it's their time of awakening, but it's night for the devotees. And verse 70, let's have a look here. 70 and 71. So it's interesting, isn't it, that the mind that desires just sort of, they're kind of self-starting. Yeah. So, but just so desires in verse, 70, Lord Krishna says that the flow of desires through the mind, they're like rivers going into the ocean. But the ocean is not affected by the rivers. Even, you look at it, the ocean doesn't really get any fuller. The water's pouring in. There's just thousands of liters a minute or whatever. But the ocean stays the way it was. So the advanced devotee, even though the mind is there and sometimes it may sort of, just like the body, sometimes the body doesn't feel good just because of its physical constitution, something goes wrong. So the mind is also, it's a body. And sometimes the mind can go a little wrong. But the devotee is not affected if the mind becomes a little disturbed by some material experience or something like that. Then the devotee, like the ocean, the devotee doesn't become affected, but the devotee rather carries on in Krishna consciousness. And then 71, this is the person, and this is Krishna's summing up really. The person who's given up all desires for sense gratification, meaning, as different from just sometimes the passage of some thoughts. Here we're talking about actual desires. For a person who's given up desires for sense gratification and who lives free from desires, who's given up all sense of proprietorship and is devoid of false ego, that person alone can attain real peace. So, on the surface of it, it just sounds like some very staunch spiritual person, something like that. But actually, who is Krishna talking about? Well, Prabhupada explains in the purport, to become desireless, because that's the point here, given up all desires for sense gratification. To become desireless means not to desire anything for sense gratification. Let me just repeat that. To become desireless means not to desire anything for sense gratification. In other words, desire for becoming Krishna conscious is actually desirelessness. This is the point. This is the point in all these verses. Even if they don't mention that you must become Krishna conscious specifically, you must think of Krishna, you must chant Hare Krishna. Even if if Krishna doesn't specifically say that, that is the understanding, which is mentioned specifically in some cases. But then we have to be able to apply that in the other cases where it's not so specifically pointed out. I hope that's clear. Anyway, Srila Prabhupada, in the purport to verse 71, he goes to great lengths to make this point, that Krishna is saying, okay, give up desires for sense gratification, live free from these desires, give up sense of proprietorship, give up false ego. What does it mean? It means become Krishna conscious, desire for Krishna, desire to serve Krishna. Then you can become free from selfish desires. But if you don't desire to serve Krishna, you're just going to be plagued by desires for sense gratification because you can't stop it. You can't stop it. And then to give up the sense of proprietorship, how can you do that? Through knowing that Krishna is the proprietor. Everything belongs to Krishna, and therefore you as a devotee, you have to engage everything in Krishna's service and devoid of false ego. False ego literally means that we think we are something which we are not. And in general, in basic terms in this world, people are thinking, I am this body, but they are not their bodies at all. It's a totally false identity. So this is false ego. So this person here, Krishna is describing in verse 71, devoid of false ego. It does not mean that the person has no sense of identity at all, that I'm just a nothing. No, the impersonalists, they think like that I don't really exist as an entity. I am just part of the great oneness, not my own part, not my own part, but just to merge in my identity, everything becomes lost in the magnitude of the oneness. So how do you do this? Through accepting the real ego, that I'm not these things, so what am I? I am the eternal servant of Krishna. That's real ego. And if you do that, of course, such a person alone can achieve real peace. So we're almost at the conclusion of chapter 2. There's a little note from Prabhupada from one of his classes on these verses here. We don't have to kill our desire. Desire is the constant companion of all living things. Because we're alive, we have desires. Inanimate things have no desires. If our desires are material, we engage in sense gratification. But if we engage our senses in serving Krishna, then he will free us from all material desires. This is where true happiness lies. So by his mercy, if we engage our senses ourselves in serving Krishna, then by his mercy, he'll free us from all material desires. All right, and the final verse, 72, it's a summary, really. That is the way of the spiritual and godly life, after attaining which a man is not bewildered. If one is thus situated even at the hour of death, one can enter into the kingdom of God. So, Srila Prabhupada has given his purport there. It's a sort of moderate length purport. One of the main things he focuses on is that it's not so difficult. If you're Krishna conscious, it's not so difficult. And Prabhupada in the purport gives the famous example from the 9th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam of Kathvanga Maharaj. Kathvanga. Prabhupada, what now? He doesn't seem to really tell the whole story. I'll just briefly mention that Kathvanga Maharaj, he was a human being, king, resident of planet Earth, but he was extremely powerful, just super exceptionally powerful. And one time the demigods were fighting with the celestial demons, and they were struggling. They were struggling. They were in trouble. The demons were getting the upper hand. So they requested Kathvanga Maharaj, even though he's not a demigod, he's not on that level, generally speaking, but he's famous as a big warrior. They asked him, can you please help? And he helped. And through his help, they defeated the demons. And then the demigods were feeling so satisfied and so pleased by the assistance given by Kathvanga Maharaj. They told him, you've helped us so much. We want to reciprocate. Tell us what you want. Tell us what you want, and it's yours. It's out of gratitude. So he said, yes, I want to know exactly when will I die. That's a pretty advanced request. The demigods had a little discussion, and they came back and said, you know what? You're going to die in 1 minute. And he just focused himself in Krishna consciousness, went back to Godhead 1 minute later. It's in the 9th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. So in other words, Krishna consciousness, it's not so difficult. It's a lot easier and a lot better, Prabhupada mentions, than other processes like Brahman realization, Brahma nirvana, and all these types of things, material sense gratification. Those things are difficult. But to become Krishna conscious, it's much easier. And here's a quote from Prabhupada from a class on this verse, or one of the verses just right around here. A devotee asks, which is more important, to go back to Godhead or spread Krishna consciousness? Prabhupada, well, one who is preaching Krishna consciousness, he's already back to Godhead. Iha yasya hare dasye karmana manasagira. Preacher means he's engaged his body. Well, that verse, Prabhupada's just quoting a verse. It's in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Iha yasya hare dasye karmana manasagira. That's someone who engages their activities, their minds, their words in service to the Lord, immediately becomes transcendental. So Prabhupada says, preacher means he's engaged his body, his mind, and his speech only to glorify the Lord. That is the meaning of preacher. So anyone who's engaged in preaching is jivan mukta sauchyate, which is another line from the same verse. He's liberated even in this life. Why should he seek liberation when he's already liberated? He's already back to Godhead. He's already with Krishna. So just remember that, devotees. Remember that. We got to really try and help spread Krishna consciousness, because if we're really absorbed like that, Prabhupada's saying here, you're already back to Godhead. Yes. Why should he seek liberation when he's already liberated? Isn't it a nice point? Amazing. All right. So there we go. That's the end of chapter 2. But we will begin chapter 3. Perhaps. Anyway, we'll begin. So first of all, a little introduction. And actually, we've taken this introduction. It is from the purport of the last verse in chapter 3. Yeah. So it's coming from right at the end. It's verse 43. And Prabhupada, in retrospect, gives a summary, you could say, of this third chapter. So let's read through it so we'll understand what we're going to be studying. And we're going to be studying, just for your information, that our next session is on Friday. There will not be tomorrow. There will not be on Thursday. Janmashtami, Srila Prabhupada's Vyasa Puja. We're going to focus on those programs. So Friday will really go deeper into chapter 3. But let's just read this by way of introduction from the purport of verse 43. This third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is conclusively directive to Krishna consciousness by knowing oneself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without considering impersonal voidness the ultimate end. Excuse me. In the material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by propensities for lust and desire for dominating the resources of material nature. Desire for overlording and for sense gratification is the greatest enemy of the conditioned soul. But by the strength of Krishna consciousness, one can control the material senses, the mind, and the intelligence. One may not give up work and prescribe duties all of a sudden, but by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, one can be situated in a transcendental position without being influenced by the material senses and the mind, by steady intelligence directed toward one's pure identity. This is the sum total of this chapter 3. This is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of material existence, philosophical speculations and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so-called practice of yogic postures can never help a man towards spiritual life. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence. So there you go. And let me just run through here just quickly and then we'll finish. There are 5 sections. There are 42 verses in this chapter, and they're divided into 5 sections as follows. So, first of all, section A is verses 1 and 2. And the subject matter is confusion, renunciation, or work. What to do? Renunciation or work. Verses 1 and 2. And then section B, the second section, is from verse 3 to verse 9, and the subject matter is fight. Do your duty without attachment. Fight. Make the garlands without attachment. In Krishna, with attachment to Krishna. So it's verse 3 to verse 9. Then section C, the third part, it's from verse 10 to verse 16. Verse 10 to verse 16, and it's basically going from karma kandya to karma yoga. This third chapter is titled Karma Yoga. So this third section then, going from karma kandya, just materialistic religion, just for your personal benefit, to karma yoga, doing your duty and offering to the Lord. That transition from verse 10 to verse 16. Then section D is from verse 17 to verse 32. That's quite a long section. And the subject matter is acting in karma yoga in order to set the right example. 17 to 32, acting in karma yoga to set the correct example. And then section E, the fifth section from verse 36 to verse 42, beware of lust and anger. Watch out. They are after you. Beware of lust and anger. All right. So that's just a little glimpse into chapter 3. We will go right into it on Friday, and then Monday, it won't take so long. It's not such a long chapter. But anyway, we'll go through it in a few days, starting Friday. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.